Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so pleased that many of you could join us for our Greening the Landscape conversation series this year. To me, it's strange to think that 1 year has kind of flown past since our last conversation series was in the fall of 2024. For this event, we have nearly 300 people registered for the conversation today. My name is Jason Henry from the Vineland Research and Innovation Center, and I'm proud to take part in this event as your moderator. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to express our deep appreciation for the land on which we're hosting this series. Our research center is a remarkable place and built upon a very unique landscape that has been essential for people for millennia. These lands are the shared traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, many of whom continue to live and work in this territory today. In our research and in our activities on this land, we aim to engage in activities that show respect to the land and Indigenous rights. The conversation series that you are taking part in today is an important platform for sharing the excellent research going on in urban forestry. We are extremely pleased to tell you that ISA Ontario is on the conversation series today. If you are an ISA member looking to collect CEUs for this session, please remain in the webinar for the full duration of the event. This will allow our event metrics to show you that you attended the entire session. There is no need for you to reshare your ISA certification number here, as you've already done so with the registration. Before we begin the conversation series with our excellent panelists, I want to take a moment to briefly share the context for our gathering and a few exciting developments as shared by my colleague, mentor, and friend, Rhoda DeYoung. Rhoda leads the Greening the Landscape Research Consortium, the host of this event.
Thanks so much, Jason. So glad we could be here. It's great to have so many folks joining us, and I see the lobbies continuing to fill up. If you missed some of Jason's initial announcements, we'll have shared some of this in the Q&A. The chat's been disabled for the event today. So these conversation series are hosted by this amazing group that we have called the Greening the Landscape Research Consortium. And this is a collaborative group of all these different actors along the urban tree value chain. So from tree nurseries, landscape architects, urban foresters, landscapers, product and substrate suppliers, among others. They all take part in taking care of our trees from the time that they're little till they're big behemoths in our municipal forests, our parks, and our lawns. The consortium works together to build the collective capacity of this urban tree value chain by developing knowledge, sharing this knowledge, such as we're doing in this event today. And we have so many of our consortium members to thank in helping to build the content for today and our series. The consortium was launched back in 2021 with just 14 members, and now we're in our second 3-year phase, and we have over 25 members. This consortium conversation series is a 2-part series. So we have this really excellent event that I'm kind of geeking out about for today. But then we have a second one that will happen on November 17th as well, where we will talk about the public health benefits of urban trees with leading medical experts who happen to see trees as an excellent tool in improving both our emotional and our physical health. I often think it would be pretty remarkable if we could have doctors prescribe not just like a walk in the woods, but building woods. So prescribing trees on your front lawn. Anyway, that's for the 17th. We'll have a link to registering for that event in the Q&A as well if you want to join us. In this Greening the Landscape Research Consortium, it's more than just sharing knowledge at events like this, it's building knowledge too. So we work together on different case studies. One is on improving use of technology in urban woodlot management. Another is identifying best technologies for urban hardscape plantings. You know, all those squishy little spots between sidewalks and roads that you want to put a tree in. Analyzing ways to improve soil management in urban landscapes, improved and easy to use mapping tools to better understand different aspects of our urban forests, particularly social equity. And then lastly, our fifth one is the potential economic benefits of planting smaller tree stock. And that's a case study that really spurred, the topic for today. We all want to see how young trees can survive for the long run in our stressed urban environments. And we want to know how we can do this better. How can we do this better?
That is a perfect point and a excellent segue into our discussion here today. I'm so pleased that we have two outstanding researchers that can kind of help us really assess these questions and really dig deeper into the conversation. So before we begin with the questions, I want to introduce our two panelists today. We have Dr. Ed Gilman. Dr. Gilman is a professor of urban trees and landscape in the Department of Environmental Horticulture at the University of Florida. He has been on the faculty since 1986 and teaches arboriculture while conducting research on tree planting and pruning. His research focuses on tree selection, urban design, nursery production, and urban tree management. He has authored over 200 or 120 peer-reviewed scientific papers and 6 books, including the widely acclaimed An Illustrated Guide to Pruning. And personally, we have this copy in our lab, as it is such a perfect guide for illustrating tree pruning. In recognition of his contributions, he has received many awards over the years, one being the Award of Merit in 2016, the highest honor from the International Society of Arboriculture. We also have Dr. Deb Hilbert, or as our students sometimes call her, Dr. Deb. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Sustainable Resource Management at the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. Her research focuses on sustainable urban landscaping with an emphasis on urban forestry and arboriculture. Her key interests include urban tree growth, species diversity, canopy cover, and human decision-making related to urban tree management. She leads applied transdisciplinary studies on her urban tree health, survival, and the influence of human decision-making on urban tree spaces. She has also authored numerous peer-reviewed publications in this field. For me personally, I look up to both of these as and feel lucky, incredibly lucky to join them in the conversation today. We have a few questions lined up for our guests to start our discussion. We have a few minutes timed at the end of this discussion to take on additional questions at the hour mark. I see some people raising their hands, and that's great to see. I love that people are very eager to jump into the questions. But we have a Q&A discussion area where these questions can be added in. The chat function has been disabled for this event, and so anyone can put in their questions that they're interested in discussing. So right now, I'm going to jump into it, and I do have a secret to tell everyone before we begin with the questions. I have to admit, we did ask our panelists this question beforehand, and Ed shared with us that he would love to share a few of his slides with us, as this is a very visual topic. So I wanted to give this out so that everyone knew Ed just doesn't have a slide deck on standby to start these conversations. So let's begin by asking the biggest question of them all. And I'll start with Ed. Why is early root structure so important for tree production and long-term survivorship? And related, What are the risks we face if root defects aren't fixed at the time of planting? So Ed, you can share your slides now.
Very good. All right, I guess good afternoon, everybody. If I can find my PowerPoint here. All right, let's start with this one. All right, we got 5 minutes. So here's what happens in nature with root systems, right? So the taproot goes down, whether it's a maple or an oak, hickory, whatever. The taproot goes down and eventually meets an area in the soil it doesn't like very much. And then the surface roots start to come out. And you can see on the right-hand side, there's an oak. You see those surface roots right under the surface, and they're straight and right under the soil surface. So that process is a natural process. It takes place over days and weeks and months, first few days, weeks, months of the germination, and then you'll see this is about 4 or 5 years later. It's one of the first root systems I dug up in the mid 70s, and you can see some roots that go down at an angle, but the big action is up near the top. And I spray painted them white back then so you could see them and distinguish them from the soil. So that's nature. So that's what we should be looking for, but unfortunately we see this. So where does this come from? From the nursery, that first kink you see with the red arrow comes from the first liner that plant was in, the first propagation container. And our every tree we plant, you plant, I plant, either has come from a container or come from a seed sown in a outdoor bed, very loose soil. And the second, so here we're producing a plant from a container, and you can see the second area of deflection was out in this area. So the tree was already in two pots, and both have put an imprint on that root system, an imprint, an impression, and that's pretty permanent. So what can happen? Two things to answer Jason's question. The first is a very healthy tree, and here's one of about 5,000 that blew down in a 70-mile-an-hour, barely a hurricane, actually strong tropical storm. And you can see the tree was very healthy, one of 5,000 trees that went down in this nursery, but it was unstable. So health and stability have very little to do with each other in the first 20 years or so. So you can see those circling roots still left that imprint on the container. Very few roots grew out into the soil. The reason is because roots have to be injured in order for them to grow new roots out from a circling root. They have to be injured, in other words, cut. So if you don't cut them, you're going to get this. So we've learned, this is 21 years ago, and man, we have learned a lot. So when you're out there selecting trees, there's nature in the upper left, and you have the choice either to pick this type of root system, which is a field-grown root system, or this one lower left, which is always been in a container. So neither of those are good. The root system in the upper right, all the roots are going down at an angle that puts the new roots that are germinated from the end of these cuts have to grow up to the surface in order to survive. That's stress. That's part of transplant stress. In fact, that's probably a big part of transplant stress. So, and then on the lower left, you see all those circling roots, especially at the bottom. There's a big party at the bottom. Yes, we don't want that. So on the right, you see the goal, straight roots, some of those at the surface. And we published this this study back in 2013. So we started this in about 2008, probably the way things go, 2007 or so. So if you're looking down at an ideal root system, this happens to be a Sweetenia, which is a mahogany tree, South Florida, Caribbean, all over the place, northern, central, or northern South America. You'll see lots of mahoganies planted. You'll see straight roots about finger size or pencil diameter size, and they're originating from the top of the root ball, right at the trunk where it meets the soil. Very important. Remember that slide because it'll be on the test. So what happens is in a container, the roots are deflected down. Now, yes, some are deflected around, but first are deflected down. And where does that put the root tips? Look, and you can see for yourself in that middle photograph. Puts all the root tips at the bottom. So when you can that up to or move that up into a bigger container, you see most of the roots, lower right, are at the bottom of that 5-gallon container, which is the next container from the propagation liner. So it should look like something like on the left, that's nature, and that root system on the right has nothing to do with nature. So this is the way good root systems are developed. The taproot grows down to the bottom of the first pot it's in, a 2-inch, 3-inch, 4-inch pot, maybe 4 to 6 or 8 inches deep. And the taproot grows out the bottom of the container, which is full of holes. In fact, it's all holes, very low plastic. And this wave of new roots goes up to the top of that taproot, and then it's ready to pot into the next container. So you've already got the start of straight roots, and some are at the surface because you stopped the taproot from growing. So here's a pretty good photograph of growing plants. On the left is a pistachio, which is a very taproot species, grown in a paper pot called an Ellie pot, and we've worked with several pots, Pioneer pot and others. But you can see by the red arrow the aborted taproot, because it grew out the bottom, got air pruned, and that wave of new roots growing up the taproot. You can see a new root there in the upper right. So this plant is almost ready to pot up into the next. And when you move it on, here's a wonderful photograph that, in fact, both of these are from Brian Kempf. And you'll see that ideal root system from the side on the left. That's an oak tree from California. So sort of an action shot of that paper pot. You can see the roots grow right through this paper pot and grow out to the next container size. And if the next container is also air pruned, you get just an amazing root system. Now, this is what's called a whip that would go into the field very easily, or into the next container if you're a container nursery. So what? So we wanted to answer the same thing. So what? So what is the difference between the root system I showed you there on the right and the root system you see on the left? When we plant them out like we did here, waited a year and pulled them over using a winch, we found that the trees with the great root system, like on the left, were much harder to pull over. The root system on the right, which had lots of deep roots, very few shallow roots, was not well connected to the soil. The last slide will show you the result of planting the left tree 7 years after planting. And this is the maple tree, if you can believe it. Maple tree grown in red maples, and the crosses, the Freemans with the silvers are very common to have roots all over other roots and circling roots and so forth. So here we are, grew this plant in various containers, and 7 years after planting, we got straight roots, some at the surface, perfect root system. All right, there you go, ladies and gentlemen. That'll give you a head start. Enough to be dangerous.
Well, thank you so much for sharing those slides. And I'm also surprised now that you have a test at the end that you mentioned, but guess we'll all be prepared for that. Deb, do you have anything further to add as to why folks should care about early root structure?
Sure. So in addition to some of those stability concerns that Ed touched on, there are also problems that can arise later on once that tree is mature that start with the root system. So in situations where the roots are growing down and deep, eventually they're going to need to come back up, right? Because that's where there's more air and water. And what can happen, especially in compacted soils, is that when those roots grow back up, they'll kind of circle around the tree and that looser soil close to the tree, and they can become circling or girdling roots later on. Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest concerns. And then I also want to touch on the point that with some of these root systems that are crossing over themselves under the ground, so not necessarily stem girdling roots, they can actually damage their own root system too. Some trees are fine with it. The roots will graft together, or then it's not an issue at all. But with others, you can have girdling of really large, important structural roots. And these issues aren't going to appear until way down the line. So this is why it took so long, I think, for arborists to realize that this problem all came back down to root structure for small trees, is because we didn't really notice the decline these really old trees as being related to some of these really early root issues.
Perfect. And I really like the point about the roots having to go up. We always forget that trees are so massive. They could be 20, 30 meters tall. Sorry, not a metric system for you too, but the root systems are always shallow. And so that's where the oxygen is, that's where usually the water is. And so that's an excellent point for longevity of these trees.
Well, in a lot of urban soils, they are shallow, but there are, like, for example,
Mhm.
if you go Central Valley, California, where the soil is a quarter to a half a mile deep, sorry about the American, the roots can go down 60, 80 feet or more documented, you know. So it depends on the soil, but lots of urban soils, of course, result in shallow soil, shallow root system. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. I was in urban space specifically.
Yeah,
Perfect.
like even
And
parts of Long Island, well, you've got lots of deep, sands and, or Wisconsin. I mean, there's sandy soils everywhere we go. There are some sandy soils.
well, that actually leads, and your slide deck also leads to the next question. And you mentioned it too. You have a training montage where straight roots, some at the surface. Can you suggest one or two nursery practices that have an oversized impact on improving root structure for young trees? And I'll start with I'll start with Ed first.
Absolutely. You got to start with from the seed or the tissue culture or the cut. You've got to start there. You have to. It's very difficult to correct. So you start in a pot that has a air prune bottom and air prune side. Really crucial to do that. Taproot is aborted when it goes down, hits the bottom of the pot, goes out the pot at night in a greenhouse typically, where humidity is 100%. And then during the day, the humidity dries down a little bit. That taproot that's hanging outside the bottom of the pot gets killed. It turns brown during the day. And then you start getting those roots over the period of weeks along that taproot. So that's a really good place to start. If you want to add to that.
Deb, do you have anything else to add for this?
No.
Well, the big downside is if we start in a field, like if you go to the Pacific Northwest or up or like Lake Erie, the South, Lake County there, where there's a lot of nurseries upstate in the air, a lot of these soils are loamy and sandy and very well drained. So when you put the seed to germinate the root system that will become the bottom stock, I forget, I'm not a propagator, but the bottom stock, the root system, you're growing the root system, those roots are all going to go down. So that taproot gets cut. And when the taproot gets cut, you get the spider that develops at the bottom of the cut. So above that spider is 6 or 8 inches of taproot. The trunk starts way up here. So this is taproot here. And it looks like the grower planted too deeply. But it was really that undercut that started the development of this. And see how they're oriented is down. And so, like Deb mentioned, those roots have to come up in order for this thing to get established because the oxygen using in urban soils is not great down there at 12 inches, 14 inches, where the root tips are of the cut. So that was tradition. We've been doing that for 100 to 120 years. So that's where we are. Starting in the right pot. Isn't it ironic? Starting in the right pot can give us the great root system.
Perfect. So ironically, we're going to switch gears from roots right now because there's a few questions that we have with regards to, actually, sorry, we're not going to switch roots, switch. We're going to switch with Deb and ask her the first question first. So my third question I have, and let's call it, it's about outside of the nursery. And this is the common question I get where you receive a load of trees on site, and some have ascending, descending, or circular roots. It might be one tree, it could be a few trees in the load. Are there different ways that people outside of the nursery and the urban tree value chain to improve root structure?
Yeah, and I'll actually back up a little bit before you get those trees.
Ooh.
off the trailer if that's okay. I'll try to
That
keep it
sounds
short.
good too.
But I think it can start at the specification and design stage, even before you receive those trees. And so landscape architects and urban foresters and other folks can specify root quality standards in their plant lists and their contracts and design specs. And there are a lot of really good resources out there for that. So there are planting details and specifications from the Urban Tree Foundation that Ed and folks put together. You can also find those on the ISA website, and they're in the process of revising those currently. The Florida Grades and Standards for nursery plants are another good resource. I'll link all of these in a chat. But it's important to note that when you're specifying trees, you can do more than just specify the species and the caliper. You can be explicit about acceptable root architecture or structure. And then, okay, you receive the trees, and instead of rejecting them, you kept them. So now what do you do? There has been some really good work again. Ed and some of his colleagues were really instrumental in this, but yeah, there's evidence that there are some modifications you can make to root systems that don't cause significant harm or physiological harm to the trees. And so in the case of roots like J roots or L roots, or where you have a deflection point that's at a right angle or maybe even more, you can prune those back to the point where it's straight, right? So at that deflection point, prune it, because those deflection points, which I don't know if we actually talked about this, but in addition to being unstable because they don't spread out, they are also weak points in the root system mechanically. So if you prune there, you're removing that weak point and encouraging the root to regenerate straight. If you have circling roots, which is especially common in containerized stock, you want to, again, prune cleanly back to the point where the root starts circling. Again, you just want to encourage those roots to regenerate straight outwards. And then if you have containerized trees that have a lot of circling roots and you're doing like a big installation and don't have time to knock all the soil off and really investigate the root system, there is the root ball shaving technique. And so this is where you dig your hole, you go ahead and set the root ball down in there, and then you take a really sharp spade and just slice around about an inch around the root ball. And so that can kind of cut off a lot of those defects, those deflection points or circling roots. But if we have defects internally, which Ed showed, so from all those different stages along the nursery production line, you're not going to hit those by just doing the outer shaving. So it is limited, and I think it's most helpful when you have like a large scale installation and you need like a really efficient method for trying to just minimize as many defects as there are. And then I do want to point out that some species are able to regenerate their roots a lot better than others. And we're actually working on kind of compiling a list of these types of species. So oaks, for instance, are very sensitive to root pruning, while there are other trees or species that are like very forgiving, and you can do a lot of root pruning on them and they'll regenerate readily. But overall, I mean, I think the larger opportunity is that we can shift the market if we just consistently request and purchase those superior root systems. And we can do that through things like contract grows and really well-written specifications.
That's a really good point. And I like that you started with the nursery and talking to the nursery and starting the conversation with them. Time to do a shameless plug, I guess, but the Research Consortium does a tree symposium too, where it's how can we start talking to our nurseries and getting them involved in the process. It takes a village to put in an urban canopy, and it starts with the nursery, but it's in a group event that really does it. And so our success really lies in working together as a team. So I love that you went in on that nursery side.
Well, there, Jason, if I can just add something.
You can.
Remember that in the US, the Z60 now .2 2025 nursery stock standard was updated in April of this year. In that document, there are definitions that you're supposed to use when you prepare specifications. It in itself is not a specification. Our industry, the urban forestry industry, municipal, and others abuse that document by simply stating that the trees should be grown according to the Z60.2 nursery stock standard, and it's simply a list of definitions. And it establishes caliper to height and spread, that sort of thing, root ball size. But other than that, it's not a quality document by its own admission, if you read the forward. So it's really important that we, as an urban forestry group, understand that, because you've got to write specs yourself. And there's, like Deb mentioned, there are some examples out there of good specifications in order. And the reason why we're not getting good trees is we haven't asked for them. We, as an urban forester, we haven't asked for them. We really haven't. Florida being an exception, we have an exceptional relationship, and it's just developing relationships with people and showing the nurseries and getting to know them. And that's a good place to start, and bring them in on your committees along with LAs and contractors, urban municipal foresters as well.
Perfect. Is there any specification that you typically recommend to people to look at or start learning from?
Shameless plug, yeah.
Uh-oh.
Urban Tree Foundation, and
Ah.
I, like Deb mentioned, it was Jim Urban, myself, Tyson Carroll, and Brian Kempf, two landscape architects. Most people probably know Jim Urban, and myself. And we pounded this out with a grant from CAL FIRE, California Forestry and Fire, about 15 years ago, almost, I think, somewhere in that neighborhood. So we are about, like Deb mentioned, we are starting to revise, review, and update those. It should be available in a year and a half, 2 years or so, probably.
Amazing. That sounds exciting.
But the ones that are up there now aren't half bad.
Perfect. All right, so now we're going to switch gears for question 4. And some of the questions that we've got were actually around structural pruning. So again, I'll start with Deb, but looking above ground now. Are there guidelines you recommend for municipalities for structural pruning of young trees? Noting this work does cost money and they're labor intensive. Do you have recommended rules of thumb for this?
Sure. I mean, the key principle here is to focus your pruning resources on training younger and more recently planted trees and training them to have strong form. This will prevent you from having to go back and correct problematic mature trees. And part of this is because it is more cost effective to work on younger trees, but also it is better biologically for them. Younger trees can react a lot more resiliently to pruning damage, because that is essentially what we're doing. We're wounding them. And then also by pruning them when they're young, you're avoiding making really large pruning wounds on mature trees down the line. There are a ton of guidelines out there as far as like actual like physical documents or digital. And again, I'll just reference Ed. He has an entire book on this. There's also the ISA Best Management Practice on Pruning. Any number of those are going to be great. And in general, they recommend that kind of in those first 1 to 5 years when the trees are young, that you do young tree training, on structural pruning. So you're going to be doing the usual removing broken dead, crossing branches, and then developing like a permanent scaffold, right? Envisioning what those permanent branches are going to be with good spacing. And then you want to establish a central leader. And again, there's tons of guidelines on how to actually accomplish those priorities or prescriptions. And then, yeah, it is very labor intensive. But I like to think of young tree training as preventative medicine versus going back and having to do a really expensive surgery on a health condition that you avoided taking care of. And so it is worthwhile to put in time on these younger trees. If you don't have full staff to do it, there are additional options for you. So I've seen communities that use volunteers that have been trained to do young tree training, and they've been trained either through, like, here in the US, we have the county extension, and so they have developed tree pruning trainings for volunteers, and then in turn those volunteers become kind of like the trainers for the next set of volunteers. So that's an option. And then I think also starting with kind of those priority areas of the city. So the trees that are in like high value locations or are going to be more problematic because of the species inherent structure. So prioritizing is starting with just a few trees and then working on getting the resources to kind of expand to the rest of your trees.
That's a really interesting point about the community tree planting group. You might get a few emails on that and who's doing it, because that is an interesting and a unique approach for municipalities if they have the training capacity to do.
Mm-hmm.
Ed, is there anything you want to add to this?
You bet. So yeah, ditto, Deb, starting at planting. Now we see far too many erroneous publications in my experience and view. And there's 2 studies that back this up that tell us not to prune at planting. And I would not suggest following that advice at all. I would start with trees either pruned right before you buy the grower. There are some contractors that will pay a couple, $3 more for the grower to prune to sort of a super dominant leader. Or you can do it at planting, tip the tree over and prune the top with a pair of Felcos. So yesterday we pruned about 14, 15 trees in Macon outside there, American elms, Dutch elm resistant, and they were topped twice in the nursery to get branches. And so each spot had 3, 4, 6 leaders. I mean, there was a decent leader in, but we had competition with very tight unions. So we probably made 8 to 12 pruning cuts, half of them removal, half of them reduction cuts on those trees. And it's amazing that the change in structure so that you can put on that tree. Because if you walk from Union Station in DC across the National Mall to the Washington Monument, you will see what happens to elm trees resistant to Dutch elm disease if you don't prune them. There's a quarter of them are falling apart already, and they're only 8 to 15 inches in diameter in caliper. So that's at planting. There's already professionals at the planting site. So you can eliminate a whole pruning cycle, which involves, vehicles and people coming back to the site 2, 3, 4 years later. So you can eliminate a whole pruning cycle by pruning and planting, where the professionals are already there, teach them how to do this. And then at about year 4 to 5, and then 8 to 10, and then 12 to 15, or then year 15, and you are off to a fantastic start. So 2 or 3 prunings plus pruning and planting will give you only small cuts in the future. You're going to have your clearance, you're going to have your structure, and the trees are going to look great. Those are your 3, right? Structure, clearance, appearance. Those are your 3 main objectives.
Perfect answers. And this actually leads to question 5, and both of you started to answer this question, and it is from a research consortium member. So I want to take a bit of time kind of looking into this. So one of our municipal members is really interested in your recommendations on pruning cycles post-establishment. Do you have recommendations on specific preventative maintenance pruning? Is there a time frame that you recommend? Is it okay if you do it based on geographic area, hitting one neighborhood at a time? Or is there a better way to work on it for age class of trees? So I'll start with Deb first.
Yeah, I mean, Ed laid it out really well in his summary for the timing. I think as far as, is it okay if you do it based on geographic area versus age class? So in an ideal world, you would be doing it based on age class or roughly age class. Yeah, because so much of it is going to come down to the size of the tree and where it is at in its development of kind of like those primary scaffolding branches and central leaders and things. Now, if you are in a situation where you haven't done any, you don't have an existing pruning cycle and you have kind of a mix of different age trees that may or may not have been structurally pruned, then just from like an urban forestry efficiency standpoint, I think it's totally fine to prioritize hitting, just certain areas at a time and working your way through. If you have inventory data that shows you the distribution of different tree sizes and even species, that can help you potentially kind of hone in on which trees may be problematic and might need to be addressed first. But yeah, I understand that there's going to be a balance between kind of like the ideal structural pruning system versus what you can do with a large set of trees at an urban forestry level.
It's complex. Maintenance is complex, and there's a lot of kind of areas that we can look at. Is there one species that's kind of the species that needs typically the most pruning? Uh-oh. Oh no.
The Almaceae, so Zelkova and elms. I mean, those are the two.
Yeah,
I mean,
I agree.
I was just in Amsterdam with my wife on a cruise along the Rhine River and spent 2 days in Amsterdam. Their elms are amazing. You got dominant leads up 40, 50 feet, starting when the tree is young. So you can see lots of removal cuts along the trunk to get 20 foot of clearance, real number. My estimate, just looking at the trees. And so they've got their clearance by year 8 to 10 after planting. They've got their 18 feet or 20 feet clearance. We don't do that here. It's not the culture. I've got a colleague in Japan right now, and he's sending me all kinds of photos of ginkgos and sweet gums and liriodendrons pruned along the streets of Tokyo. And it's amazing what they do. Pruning is so cultural related, but to kind of get specific, if you get to prune on a 4 or 5 year cycle, you're going to have a great start. And I would start by taking a group of 100 trees or so, and either with your volunteers or your crews or your contracted company, and prune 100 trees or 200 this next planting season, and don't prune others, and see what develops. Show people, show growers what the issues were that you had to correct. Work with growers to try to get a more urban compatible. That's a word we use in our prescription pruning qualification, urban compatible. And we show people what that means. It means a dominant lead all the way to the top. And if we start with that, we don't even have to prune at planting. So there's a lot of detail in this, all centered around pruning the largest branches every time you come through, and prune at every pruning cycle. And that's kind of where we start.
That's perfect. And I think, yeah, training or tree maintenance kind of is hard, but it is an investment for the future. And these trees are long-term, I would say assets, not the right term, but they are living organisms too. And so
Well, you brought up, Jason, a really important word, and it's cost. And other than Chris Lully's study done 20 years ago, where by his own admission and in the paper, it really doesn't describe what was done, and because there just weren't good records. Other than that, which tells us that pruning trees in some way, we don't know how, reduces callback from the neighborhoods. So we need a 20-year or so study. Somebody, Deb, I'm looking at you, because I don't do research anymore. I've been retired from university research for 10 years now. But we need a long-term cost analysis, where the carbon is. I think we can get more carbon in the tree earlier by doing this early pruning. So take less to the dump. And there's easy data to get here, but it's going to take a young person that's going to be around a long time and follow the costs, all the inputs. It's not been done.
That's true. And I think there's one paper that I read a while ago the cost of not maintaining trees. I
Mhm.
think that was with the paper, and it does demonstrate that if you don't maintain them, they're not going to last as long. And we're all about developing our urban canopy. So the maintenance should be a big front forward.
But I think that was Greg McPherson's work, right?
Yes, it was.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think so.
Or-
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a good start, but we need to know what advantages, if there are, we think there are, of pruning early, get 2 or 3 pruning cycles in before you're 15.
Yeah,
Amazing.
I think that was a major finding of that paper is there weren't a lot of studies that have been done on pruning and pruning cycles.
No.
Sorry, Jason.
No, no worries at
Yeah.
all. Yeah,
Yeah.
perfect. All right, we have a lot of great questions coming in on the chat. I'm going to try to group a few of them together. So the first question I want to ask from the audience, are there specific planting pit styles that can improve root structure? And when I say planting pit styles, one of them being, is a square pit sometimes better than a circular pit? The other parts of this question, um, is there strategies for avoiding root circling like augering? And the third part to this question, um, how do kind of these planting pits influence hardscape soils? Are soil cells different than planting pits? There's a lot of parts to this question. Kind of squeezed everything in together. But let's first, does shape matter as a planting hole?
Okay, and to clarify, what planting pit, we're talking about like a vault, like where all the sides are hard. So much of this is going to depend on soil volume
That's
and
true.
qualities of the soil itself. That's why I'm asking for some clarification.
Well,
That's true.
we grow a lot of trees from scratch, in pots. And if you have a square pot, you get a square root system. And if you
Mhm.
have a round pot, you get a round root system. So is the square pot with what do we call that? Square roots? I don't know. But it's whatever the shape of the compacted soil,
Mhm.
depending on your soil type, 1.6 to 1.7 or so grams per cubic centimeter, wherever that's where you're going to get your deflection.
Mhm.
So if you're out in an open space, what we do is we dig a hole that's a little bigger than the pot or the brood ball, and then we then put the backfill in and we loosen the soil for 2 or 3 times the diameter of the root ball. You don't have to dig a big hole, pile it right next to the hole, and then put it all back in. That's a lot more work. So you can simply loosen it with shovels, or if you have a small backhoe, once the tree is in the ground. That's just as effective. And then you don't really have a circle or a square to worry about. Of course, you can't do that downtown in a planting pit, scenario. Then, Deb's talking about a vault, and that's a whole can of worms, isn't it?
Think let's think about this as kind of at a regular park.
Okay.
Would a square planting hole um, improve root structure? So would it stop root circling? Square
No, I
versus
mean
circle.
it's just what Ed said is what's going to cause the roots to deflect, circle, whatever we want to call it, be anything but straight and out, is going to be whatever impedes them, which could be the soil itself. Like Ed said, there are thresholds for compaction where the roots can't go through anymore. So I'm not sure, Ed, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not sure if the shape matters so much as just making sure that you have soil that's not highly compacted. Not only in the area where the root ball itself is going in, but like he said, extending beyond that 2 to 3 times the size of the root ball, because you want to encourage those roots to grow out away from the root ball.
It's just a lot of work to dig it out, make a big pile, and then put it all back in. Loosening it
Yeah.
is so much, and you can do it easy
Yeah.
with like a king of spades shovel. $180 or something for this awesome shovel. It's heavy, it's square tipped, it's sharp. You sharpen it every day at the end of the day, and you use it the next day. And you can do a great job pretty quickly if you're young. I can't do it anymore, but it's a great tool to use. to loosen the soil around the root ball without making a big hole. Because loose matters. Taking it out, putting it back doesn't. Actually, Jim Urban would tell you the aggregates that would result from the loosening might even be better than the powdery stuff you'd put back by making a big pile and putting it all back in, because you ruin the soil structure.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And the second part of the question, I'm definitely going to clarify too. So don't think I said it all right. So people are curious about the root environment in hardscape planting areas. Can you still get good quality roots in soil cells or structural and structural soils?
Yeah, you can. I mean, a benefit of those systems is that they're going to reduce compaction, which is again going to allow those roots to grow straight out and not become deflected or die back. So yes, and there are some cases where folks have looked at the root systems of trees that have been planted in structural soils and or like silvicells or um, similar products, and yeah, the roots do seem to grow more ideally, I guess I would say. But again, so much of that is also going to depend on the volume and where the edge of that pit is, because as soon as those roots hit the edge, they're going to deflect. But yeah, it absolutely can be like a great way to improve root systems, and primarily by increasing the soil volume and also reducing compaction and all the things that come with compaction.
Annette?
Any of these underground systems that promote root growth work. I think a lot of us know all the names of them. I think there's about 30 different types of underground support products sold out there. I think Jim Urban told me that there were 25 or 30 competitors to silver cells. For some reason, we know silver cells a lot more. Marketing, I guess. I don't know. First on the block. But you just got to watch your, like in structural soils, just watch your nitrogen and some of your other very leachable nutrients. So just keep an eye on that. You can lose some of that if you have a very sandy soil, especially. And eventually you're going to reach the limit of the structural soil and the silvicell or underground support cell. And but the tree's going to be bigger in the end, I think, before it declines. We all know these little parking lot islands that we see that are maybe 200 square feet or so. They've reached their limit. I mean, the live oaks I was looking at yesterday probably had 2-foot diameter after 35 years or so in Macon where I was, and they're pretty much stopping. There's 2 or 3 inches of growth now, so there's a limit to all this. And some designers, like if you go to the parking lot in Missouri Botanic Garden, in front of the Missouri Botanic Garden in St. Louis, you'll see no trees, no islands in the trees, because there are no islands. And all the trees are around like a 30-foot buffer strip around the parking lot. And every time I go there, I see the parking lot's full of cars. So it doesn't chase people away. It puts the healthy trees out and the place looks fantastic, surrounded by tilia, the oaks and maples around the parking lot, and they have plenty of soil space, so they're going to last a lot longer. And solutions like that you see when you guys travel, and a lot of people travel, you see these ideas. Why not try them where you're at?
Perfect. I have one last question. I want to be conscious of time as well. So I might give you 2 minutes to answer this question. It's a big one though. So do you have any recommendations on building a work culture that makes it easier to reject planting stock that does not meet the standard? There's a lot of pressure on people to accept trees in order to meet planting goals instead of rejecting for quality stock. Don't know who wants to jump
you
on this.
can't just draw a line, right? You have to engage people. And so I'll just tell you the experience we had at Florida and how we're able to, and somebody mentioned we had the best planted stock in the country. I don't know that. I mean, I travel a lot still, and I wouldn't disagree with that. But the way we got there, when I came to Florida in 1988, 1986, I have to tell you, we had some of the worst stock in the country. So because I was growing up in the Northeast where there was some pretty decent stock and still is in places. Yes, absolutely. And the way we did it was we stopped throwing stones at each other. And we sat down at the table and we developed this grades and standards for nursery stock with growers, consultants, um, uh, landscape architects, green industry folks. We had about 6 or 8 people on the committee, and we just pounded it out and went back to our affiliations, ISA and ASLA, et cetera, and got the buy-in and conducted training sessions. So, and then at the university level, we started growing trees and teaching ourselves at the university how to make, these guys don't have time to do research, and they got tired of me killing their trees doing research on their property. So they started writing us checks to hire 2 people. And those 2 people were supported for about 15 years or more. And that's how we figured it. So we just have to work with people, get a little bit of funding in for a hire or 2, and then start showing the growers what you're learning, and then it gets incorporated over time. That's how we did it. And that could easily be an hour conversation of all the relationships and how to build and all that, but that's the short story.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add to that because you're not going to solve the problem by avoiding those conversations, but you're not going to make any meaningful, you're not going to have any meaningful discussions with growers if you try to be very firm, like what Ed was saying. In some parts of the world and our country, developing contract grows with specifications is the best way to go about it. But even that requires having a good relationship with the grower and discussing these things far in advance. And then there are other scenarios where it can be a lot less formal, but it all goes back to just talking to your grower.
And it's more than simply talking one-on-one. I remember going to Canadian nursery, and we had probably 6 or 8 nurseries there. And this was up in Alberta, or it may have been Edmonton, doesn't matter. So we talked about these issues 20 years ago up there, and their nurseries really changed. I mean, I can point to 2 or 3 north of Kelowna in that banana belt up there, basically cherries, apples, nurseries, all up in that valley there. Forget the name of the valley, but you can't just dump this on people. Bring a spec to them, bring our spec, make up your own specification, but look at ours first so you know what a specification is, because we haven't taught in urban forestry schools what a specification is. But take a look at it. It's not the little drawing with it's not that. That's not a spec. That's a detail. So look at the whole spec. It's fairly common. A lot of words in there. So got to bring that and start the discussion with a lot of growers. And that's how you make the change.
That's, I think, a perfect way to end this conversation. It takes everyone to get urban forestry, from nursery to municipal foresters. It's an urban tree value chain for a reason, and a lot of people work towards its success. I would like to close our conversation by expressing our collective appreciation to both our panelists who joined us here today and generously shared their experience. Ed and Deb, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Our appreciation also extends to the ISAO for their collaboration. I would also like to thank all of you, all of our Greening the Landscape Research Consortium members who make the consortium possible, as well as the support from Vineland from the Sustainable Canadian Agriculture Partnership. Lastly, we'd like to thank all of you for attending. We value your feedback and excellent questions. It's clear that we are all passionate about all things urban forestry and urban greening, and love to hear from you. If you would like to join in as a member of the research consortium or continue the conversation, please reach out to us. And I believe we sent out the email for the research consortium. We hope you can all join us on the 17th for the second conversation in the series to learn more about public health benefits of urban trees. It promises to be an excellent conversation as well with leading medical researchers in this field. From all of us here, enjoy the rest of your day and please stay in touch and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you.